I want to thank Naveen for allowing me to bottle a little bit of his energy to try to keep you all awake, and I want to thank Mycroft for helping us to understand a little bit about some of that future that's going to be hopefully enabled, not just driven by AI. But first, I want to start off by taking you back 150 years. So you and I, forget the rest of the people here, you and I are standing in a windswept cornfield. And we're talking about the future of work. Now, at that time, around 1860, about 50% of all the people in the United States worked in agriculture. And you and I now have a vision of the future where we are going to help to create an industrialized society. We're going to come up with institutions like factories and organizations. We're going to create high school, which hadn't existed before. We're going to think of the ways that we can scale everything that we're doing because we've just been growing things up until now, and now we're going to make things. And we're going to make things at big scale. And now we've got 80 or 90 years to engineer this process. And by the time we're done, we'll have an industrialized society. And oh, by the way, we also have to think up jobs for 3 billion people, because by the time we reach even the mid-1900s, all those people are going to need jobs. And so here we are, we're standing in this cornfield, and we're trying to envision this future that's so hard to see, and all we have are some general indications about what's changing. So now let's fast forward to today. You and I stand in another field, and we have this breathtaking vision of a future where we have to reinvent our institutions because the pace of change, the impact of technology, the functions of globalization have all changed the dynamics of these institutions that we just thought up together 150 years ago. We have to come up with new ways of becoming lifelong learners because of that pace of change. We have to reinvent the organization because the structure, the traditional approach to how we organize people at scale is being unbundled before our eyes. We have to think of work in a completely different manner. And oh, by the way, we have to figure out how we can ensure that individuals all have the kind of meaningful, compensated work that makes them feel like they have engaged and valuable lives. How hard can this be? So I'm going to call up my guests here in a conversation, and our focus is going to be, how is the world of work changing? What is the future of work? What are the different lenses on how to think about this? How can you think about this as an individual, as part of an organization, as part of a community, as part of a society? And what are the ways we can actually help to lead this process forward to be able to create that new vision? So I'd like to bring up Erica Volini, Kelly Stephen Wise, and James Chan. So please help me in welcoming them. Please, hop in. Wonderful. So I'm going to start off with Erica. So you have had an opportunity with Deloitte to see across a range of organizations and to see sort of what you can think of as the beginning of this transition to sort of rethinking the organization a little bit. How do you think about this transition in the future? What's the lens or what's the approach that you come at this with?
I'm glad you asked. Like any good consultant.
Almost like we prepared.
Yes. I brought some slides. Slides are always helpful. It's our crutch. It's interesting, as companies are talking about future of work, I think everyone is defining it very differently. There's individuals and companies who say, the robots are coming, the jobs are going away. And then there's companies, and Kelly and I were talking about it, that are focused on reskilling, retraining the workforce. But I think what's important is to understand what really is happening. And these 4 curves here, I think, tell a really powerful story. And that story is really around productivity. Because ultimately, that's what the future of work is about. Even as you think about the example you gave or the presenter beforehand, it's about how we can get more productivity out of our workforce. And as we look and you see these curves, what we see is technology, no surprise, has the fastest curve, right? There's new technology coming into our world, whether it's automation or AI, at a very rapid pace. And individuals are adopting to that new technology very quickly. There's a new technology out there, whether it's Snapchat or Instagram or whatever the new technology is. Individuals are bringing it into their personal lives, even their work lives, and adopting to it. Where we see the challenge is in the last two curves, the business and public policy. Those curves are flattening, and that really represents the opportunity for organizations is how can they take advantage of the technology and the individual's ability to adapt to that new technology to be able to drive increased productivity for the business.
Okay.
And that's ultimately what the challenge is. And the question is, how do you get there? How do you take your workforce and create a workforce that's going to allow you to capitalize on all that technology and automation and drive that increased productivity? And whether that's looking at automation and AI is one of the angles that you look at. The other is your talent models. Okay. So we're seeing more and more companies have talent off balance sheet. And the question is, how do you leverage those new talent models, the combination of new technology, to shift the way organizations are managing their workforce? That's really the challenge that a lot of our clients are going through right now.
Got it. Okay. All right, so specifically from the lens of the organization, so I'm hearing some of the macro trends that you're talking about that the organization needs to track on sort of across the board. So, but Kelly, you're with a very specific company, thinking about a lot of these issues. How does a practitioner approach this kind of transition? How do you think about it?
Yeah, so I think it's really important today that we consider what's happening in technology, certainly, how overwhelmed people are, but also thinking of new talent operating models. So today, we need to think about the contingent workforce, but we also need to think about our internal workforce and how we create kind of that free agent feeling, that consumer experience inside the organization. Today, we don't have a lot of visibility to the skills and capabilities we have, but we know that the future of work is going away from jobs and more into really service areas or roles that people will play. So if we consider that it's more these network of teams and people that are working on projects, how do we accurately match those people to that work and leverage technology in new ways? So Eric, you mentioned off-balance sheet. I also want to challenge that off-balance sheet can also mean off your own balance sheet for your functional organization. So the fact that you may have to share talent across membranes within the company is something that we're going to really have to see, because the skill sets that are coming down the pike that we don't even know about in the future, we're going to need to reimagine the talent that we have on the inside. We won't always be able to acquire it on the outside fast enough.
Okay. All right, so James, Joshua was talking with Mycroft about sort of AI and sort of the augmentation process. How do you think of AI in the organization? Does that solve some of the process that Kelly's talking about in terms of helping people to be faster and better at the work that needs to be done?
I mean, that's the hope. That's the hope. I mean, I think that for all of us who've been involved in software for the last 20, 30 years, you realize how terrible software is and how hard it is to actually build something that works right now, let alone works for 30 years. And in some ways, machine learning is much worse. Machine learning, is a set of prediction models that end up being hard to understand, hard to build, and to be honest, that is good. These machine learning models are going to be the center of new organizations. And I think adapting to that and understanding how the world changes and creating the right sort of impedance matches to get these companies to adopt models and to understand how to use them and take advantage of them, that's the opportunity. And now, of course, as a venture capitalist, that's the opportunity I'm looking for.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about then the energy that's being put into creating those kinds of technologies and what I think of as either the disruptors so where do you see some of the greatest energies that are going into creating the technologies that are going to be used in the enterprise or be used by people to be able to sort of navigate this process?
Yeah, one of my favorite speakers on artificial intelligence spoke earlier today, and that's Barney Pell. And so if you went to Barney Pell's talk, I'm going to repeat a few of his high-level points. If you didn't go to Barney Pell's talk, you should look it up on YouTube or find his presentation, because I think it is actually one of the best ways to think about machine learning right now. And for me, it is the right way to think about machine learning is, on the one hand, they're about these prediction models, and they're about a set of predictions that you make, and you have to think about both how valuable they are and at what volume they could be sort of deployed at. And also, you have to think about sort of the downside of them. And I think what's interesting is we live in this world where a lot of the attention is around replacing what's considered low-cost labor. But the interesting thing is, like, it's low cost and it's high risk. And so it's one of those cases where I think there are many more opportunities, right, around finding high value, relatively low risk decisions that need to be made. And the irony, of course, is that's entirely ignored by most executives, in part because we make an awful lot of relatively low downside predictions in our day-to-day jobs that actually could be automated.
I agree. I actually think it calls for organizations to take a look at that whole end-to-end process. I think the mistake organizations are going to make with automation and AI and everything you're talking about is to just make it about the commodity-based work, the activities that are transactional in
or
nature.
What's perceived as commodity.
Absolutely. And the question is, how do you take a step back and re-look at your process, your work process, and completely dissect it, every single step in that process, and ask not only how can automation and AI be applied, can this be done by a different type of talent that's out there, whether they're on balance sheet or off balance sheet, and how do we want to recreate this process in a different way that we might not have before, right? So it's that mental shift of totally transforming the way that work's being done that I think is what's really exciting about the opportunity ahead of us.
Okay.
One thing I would mention, Joe, on productivity that it's really important we don't miss is there's something called the democratization of work, and combined with the empowerment that technology gives you, is that we don't want to forget that we're employing human beings, and human beings have a need to be engaged in the work that they're doing, and productivity can actually increase when employees are engaged in the work that we're doing. And so what we're experimenting with it here is breaking down traditional jobs and creating services or roles where people can make choices based on project opportunities to pick the work that they're doing at a percentage of their time. And so what we're seeing is that we are not losing productivity, we're actually gaining. So not only are they not dropping the balls in their sort of day job or what we call home base, but they're providing exponential contribution on top of that. So I just want to turn that productivity thing on its head a little bit.
Well, no, I appreciate you doing that, because I do want to sort of push back, I think, a little bit on what we tend to sort of often, the perspective and the language that we use when we come at it from the perspective of the organization. So I do want to push for, the champion of the individual. I was actually trained as a career counselor when I was 19. So I started off by just understanding the world of work from the lens of the individual. And so most people don't think of themselves as talent. They don't think of themselves as being acquired. They don't think of themselves as plugging into a productivity machine. They want to do meaningful work. And so my concern or my question is, are we thinking too incrementally? I mean, we're talking about just sort of helping organizations to innovate on the margins or move in smaller amounts. I mean, Clay Christensen and John Hagel were talking this morning about, are we basically talking about blowing up the organization? Are we talking about completely new forms of ways that people organize dynamically around trying to solve problems? So are we thinking too incrementally, or are we saying, no, we actually are on the beginning of a journey that is actually going to result in completely new forms of people coming together to be able to create value in a market?
I think it's a mix of both. I think we have to allow for incremental improvements to be made in terms of how work's being done. But the question is then, how is the organization looking at those changes and figuring out what fundamental shifts they have to take? It's almost bottom up and top down from that perspective. And to me, this is squarely the role of the HR organization to step up and drive is, how do you take the different ways in which work's being done and say, okay, how do we need to change our org structure? I know you're a CHRO yourself, right? How do we create networks of teams? What type of technology do we put in place to foster collaboration? How do we incent and measure and reward around that type of collaboration so we continue that type of culture so that we get the productivity improvements from the increased engagement? I think that's where a lot of organizations need to be thinking is, it's not just bringing in the technology and getting the individuals to think and work differently. It's then how do you embed it in your culture, in your structure, in the way your organization operates. That's how we're going to see the productivity gains. That's how that organization curve is going to start to come up to the same pace of change that the individual curve is on.
Okay.
And I think that's the formula we have to solve.
Okay. Kelly, do you
And
buy
Rome
this?
wasn't built in a day. I mean, the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that we have to meet organizations where they are today, and we have to not make this so scary. When I go out and I talk about the future of work and some of the things that my organization is experimenting with, you can imagine to an audience of CHROs, it's very scary, because it's basically disrupting everything that we've built for at least the 20th century. It was built on this hierarchy and command and control environments, and we're breaking all of that. And in order to break it, you have to drive the systemic changes, which means that the people in compensation have to accept that compensation is going to get disrupted. It means that the business models are going to get disrupted. And leadership and training and everything that we have learned for several years is the way to do it is going to have to be disrupted. And that can be very frightening. So we have to build the steps incrementally to show people that they're on a journey, that they're not going to go 0 to 100 overnight.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, James.
No, I was just going to say, that kind of fine-grained, personalized experience is either going to be sort of the best employee experience ever, or it's going to feel like Big Brother. And I think what's interesting is how it appears really is a nuanced thing. It isn't inherent in the structure. It is going to be how leaders make decisions about how to deploy and talk about the change that they're in the middle of. And I think that that's going to determine who succeeds or fails, right? Those little nuances about how they talk about their work.
Yeah, we implemented a talent platform in June, and I just got done with the town hall on Friday, and the engineers' biggest gripe was, how are you going to use this for evil? You know, how are you going to start monitoring our utilization and what we're doing? I had to spend an hour convincing the engineering population that this wouldn't be used for evil measures by going through history of all the innovations that have come out and either used or not used for evil purposes. So this is a real issue, and it will need to be driven by transparency and a commitment to the mission of why you've created the technology.
And I think, I was going to say, I think it's also about promoting it in the context of the individual and having them be part of a continuous learning culture, right? I mean, the individual knows, you know, if we think about the generation that's entering the workforce today, they'll likely have a career lifespan of 60 years. And let's think about that for a second, 60 years. The average life of a company today is 15. So just by quick math, you're going to be in at least 4 companies over the course of your career. You're going to want to make sure you're developing those skills that allow you to move from company to company, right? And you're going to want to have the best of the learning, the skills. And so if we reframe the way we're talking about the future of work, yes, there's an organizational impact. Yes, there's an impact on productivity. But for the individual, which you want to get back to, how does it benefit them and their career and the ability to continuously learn? Now we have a talk track, I think, that starts to relate to the individual as well and starts to harness that power. So again, it's that balance between benefit to the individual, benefit to the organization.
I mean, it's not all sunshine and lightning, right? It's not all great. There are certainly fundamental changes that are happening in the way that corporations are going to exist 20 years from now, in part because, I mean, for those who were around in the 90s, you'll remember learning corporations, and there was this sense that, oh, these corporations get better, but it was mostly a myth because the truth is organizations didn't learn, people learned, and they created good or bad processes and org structures. But we are soon going to live in a world where the organization is actually going to literally learn because they're going to capture the most important decisions that they make in a systemic way, build prediction models against it, and make better decisions over time. And the value of being the guy with the gray beard who claims that they remember what happened 20 years ago, that's going to shift. And what that means, I don't know, I hope Gary can solve it.
Well, yeah, I sure hope so, because I turned 60 last year. So I think I think my sell-by date is actually approaching. So we're talking about this sort of dynamic tension. Any market shifts have a series of dynamic tensions that are involved. And so you're right, it's not all sweetness and light. And as a matter of fact, the dystopian view, which is continually what is explored, as you all see in the press every day, is that robots and software are going to take jobs. And so, you know, James, your Bloomberg Beta is fundamental in helping New America Foundation to do some research called the Shift Commission, which looked at affected populations and really came up with a bunch of different scenarios that I won't ask you to walk through now, although you folks should all look up the Shift Commission's report, which is online. But talk about some of those affected populations, because with every single market transition, just as I was talking about from agricultural to industrial, there are always populations that are affected. How do you think of, we're talking about the view from the organization, now let's talk about the view more from communities and affected populations and some of the ways we might be thinking about helping them to be able to navigate these transitions more effectively.
Yeah, so just for context, so the Shift Commission is something you did with this wonderful organization called New America, based in DC, in which we went with them to 6 different communities throughout the United States, met with tech, business, and political leaders, and we did this scenario planning exercise, which for many of you will seem obvious. Sort of rather than predicting the future, what you should do is you should imagine what are the ways the future might look, and then react to that, right? That's always easier. Yeah. The clever thing that I think we did that was a little bit different is rather than think about it from the point of view of the politician, the mayor, or the tech leader, what we did is we said, here are these cards, and these cards are demographically representative of the US demographics, and play the role of that person. So rather than playing a role of the 10% or the 1%, play the role of like everyone else, and think about how these scenarios actually change your life. And I think what was interesting and exciting about that is that there are solutions out there, and there are a whole set of new problems that come out of those solutions. If rather than just thinking about a world in which there are more jobs or less jobs, we think about a world in which there's more jobs, less jobs, maybe the jobs get atomized, but maybe they don't, right? And I think in that world, there are a set of common problems that come up and common solutions, especially some around regulation, but a lot around entrepreneurship and the distributed nature of new jobs and new opportunities. And I think that's what was quite exciting. And so for those who are interested in this, it's just Google Shift Commission and Bloomberg, or Shift Commission and Anne-Marie Slaughter. And it's, the work that we've done is quite interesting. And the best story, though, which I got to share for one moment, which is we did a focus group with truck drivers in Ohio, in which we said to them, here's a demo of this thing. We're not telling you what it's called, but here's a demo of this thing, which is a self-driving truck. And then, how do you guys think about it? And what was fascinating was that for the first 15 minutes, the focus was entirely on the benefits for the drivers, where they said, you know what, actually, this means I can sleep, or this means that I'll be fine, sort of like, I won't need to be with another annoying guy. I can just be with, it could just be me with the augmented truck. And I think that the realization, and it took a while for folks to say, oh, wait a minute, how does this actually affect my job? What does this mean? And I think those sorts of questions really are out there, and but they require a little bit of digging, and that's the sort of thing that we have to do right now. Right. And I think that's the interesting opportunity out there.
So, I just want to add on to that. I think the other question is, so there's 3 choices, right? There's, my job is replaced. Okay, that's your not sunshine, right? There's, parts of my job are being replaced, and but there are opportunities for me to take on new work that I might not have done before. And then there are net new roles that are going to be created. One of the things we're finding, I did a panel with 4 organizations that have implemented robotics, right? And everyone was expecting us to talk about the impact on the workforce and how it's eliminated jobs. What we ended up talking about was the net new roles that were created to help manage the automation. Right? They called them bot farmers and bot managers. So the bot farmers were a net new job that would go out and look at all the work processes that were out there and figure out where more automation could be applied over time. Right. The bot managers were the individuals that looked at all the automation that was happening and made sure it was functioning appropriately, were on call, etc. Those jobs did not exist before they put automation in place. So to me, the question is, let's break down what the impact is instead of it being a scare tactic or too much sunshine, all right? There is something in between, and I think if we start to brainstorm around what net new roles, jobs might be created, we have a whole different talk track to consider.
I'm just trying to imagine a former truck driver trying to tell his or her parents that they're going to become a bot farmer.
But it's true, right? If you're to think about the most widely deployed machine learning model out there right now is probably Google's search engine. Right? And there are easily 100 to 200 times more people working on SEM and SEO than there are people actually working on the search engine. Right. And I think that's what you're going to see in the future. Exactly. But that does mean a lot of flexibility and a lot of change. Right. But it does mean that there will be jobs.
Not just flexibility, but flexibility to your point around it's not jobs, it's roles, it's competencies, right? Because there's certain competencies there. And then how do you use those roles within the organization across functions or across organizations? And you can start to see how the organization is going to start to transform and what the possibilities are. I think that's a little bit of what you're doing.
Yeah,
now.
and I think what we tried to do as well at here is that we took a skill set, for example, that's up and coming, or we have a low supply of, let's say, machine learning is highly competitive right now. We don't know what it'll be in a couple of years. But we did it, we ran a hackathon with employees to visualize machine learning skill sets and what skills were correlated to machine learning, for example. And we found that there were 5 other skills correlated to machine learning. And we built a program to be able to determine a path by which we could reimagine the people in the outer correlated skills to be machine learning experts in the future and how to apprentice them against those folks. So these are ways we get out of the doom and gloom of, well, if you didn't study machine learning and you're not a machine learning expert, well, I'm sorry, you took the short straw. But how we keep the optimism and that growth mindset that we can continue to upskill and train people. And that you're absolutely right, Eric. The new jobs will emerge out of the job elimination. And so that's a big thing that we're going to see in the future.
So I'm going to open up the questions in just a second. I'd like to ask if you want to ask a question, raise your hand, and one of the mic runners will come find you. I'm going to ask one more question before we go to the audience, though. So you talked earlier about the rise of the contingent worker. And again, I think most people don't think of themselves as contingent. They probably think of themselves more as independent workers. A recent survey said 40% of all workers in the United States think of themselves as being independent or having some part of what I call a portfolio of work. So some part of what they do is independent, even if they have a day job. So again, we're talking a fair amount, I think, from the mentality of how the organization determines how people are sort of pegged to the kind of work that they do. But with the rise of more independence and therefore more agency by the people who are working, how does the organization become the place where people can more flexibly and dynamically find the work that needs to be done? Because right now, again, we've got this structure that typically is telling them where they need to go.
So here we built a talent platform yet to be named, but it's a bit of an internal LinkedIn on steroids, where we create a set of opportunities by strategic buckets in the company, and we give people access to those opportunities. And those opportunities are not jobs. They are a set of services. So it would be a software engineering service at a percentage of time. We also give visibility from our people to our people. So people have profiles. And it's not a profile that you would have externally. It's what you love to do, what you aspire to learn. We have algorithms behind to match mentor relationships. We don't monitor mentoring. It is a grassroots kind of thing because in the future, people just want to find their own way and find their own people. This is the democratization of work, choice on both sides between employer and employee, and using technology to empower and to create culture and collaboration. Because in a world where you need to create that free agent nation on the inside, again, you won't be able to acquire fast enough on the outside. We have to start looking in our ecosystem internally to reimagine those people. So that's how we give them that feeling.
Right, no, I absolutely agree. So just a quick commercial. Tomorrow we've got a workshop. Jeff Schwartz from Deloitte is going to talk about some of these organizational transformation processes, and I'm going to talk about, from the view of the individual, some of the personal transformation that goes along with this new world order of dynamically binding around problems. So I can't see with the light here, do we have any questions out there in the audience? I've got one up front here.
Yeah, my name is Deepak Sharma. I'm from India. I run co-founded a co-working business in India. The organization, when you talk about an organization, conceptually, the way we figure out the organization will change, because if 50 to 60% of the workforce is going to be contractual, they aren't going to an ecosystem which an organization creates. They're going to be a totally different ecosystem, whether that's a co-working, whether it is a community-based working. So how does that change the way people look at organization as a whole, and how does organization manage that when we talk about an organization, when people are going to be distributed, working in different ecosystems?
Yeah, it was funny when you were talking, when Kelly was talking about that, I was thinking that's an internal ecosystem, but I think there's going to be an emergence of external ecosystems, and I agree with you that it's going to change what the face of the organization is. I think one of the things we're seeing is this emergence of networks of teams, right? And I think that's what the organization is going to start to evolve to. Now, will the hierarchy ever fully go away? I think that's TBD. But the idea that you start to have these networks of teams that form that are made up of employees, people off balance sheet, other organizations that become part of that team, right, is where the organizations are going to emerge. And I think what we're going to see is we're going to have to rethink, how do you manage these networks of teams in order to drive the productivity that you want out of them? How do you manage them? How do you create the infrastructure and the collaboration for them to work with one another? And how do you make sure they're all focused on a singular goal and the mission of the organization? So from my point of view, it changes everything. What the job architecture looks like, how to do performance management, what the reward structure looks like in order to incent that behavior. But I think these networks of teams is that construct that we're going to see organizations emerging to, and it's going to look very different than the traditional hierarchy we're seeing today, because to your point, we're managing within an ecosystem now that's very broad versus everyone sitting within one organization. It's a fascinating change that we're going to be experiencing.
So I'm an investor in a couple of verticalized labor marketplaces. There's a company called Wonder that does research requests for a lot of management consulting firms, and then a company called Gigster that ends up doing actually software development for a number of big corporations. And what's interesting is, in those cases, the individual's identity is now with the guild, which is, say, with the team of people on Wonder, or the team of people on Gigster, and they're all connected on Slack. Sort of that's their primary source of identity. And the relationship then with the company that contracts, it's just a very clear API, and the accountability is like incredibly important. And so in some ways the boundaries change, but the questions and where you're still deriving identity, you're still enjoying your work.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. People have a need to associate. They have a need to build a tribe. It's all about how they're going to build the tribe in the future. In fact, one of the in one event that I spoke at recently, a group of independents have actually created their network of team. They actually called themselves, they have a structure, they have an organization, yet none of them work in the same place. They're all remote. Now, they're professional services firms, so it's a little bit easier to do, but they even have communities of practice within. And they're only 40 people. So they easily could hang shingles on their own, but they want to associate. What they miss when they're free agents, they need it to bounce things off of, et cetera. So they've created a loose tribe or a network of team of those 40.
So I'm going to jump out of my moderator box and have an opinion. I'm going to add one more thing to what Kelly was saying. Is the other thing that people want to do is they want to solve problems. So just to give the insight from the workshop tomorrow, we're all problem solvers. At the end of the day, we're paid to solve problems. That's why an employer hire gives us money. And so we want to solve the problems that we love to solve. We all have innate skills and capabilities, and there are particular kinds of problems we are just wired to want to solve. So one of the answers for what is the organization of the future, what's its purpose? It's to provide the environment under which people want to be able to solve specific kinds of problems. And we've used a hierarchy to be able to try to do the sorting function in the past, and in the future it will be a completely different process. Other questions, please?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm head of partner ecosystem at EdCast, which is a AI-powered knowledge infrastructure that's kind of looking at empowering and powering continuous learning and micro-learning within organizations or individuals or broader spectrum. I'm also an alumni of Singularity University, so I'm very geared towards the exponentiality of how a lot of disruptive change is coming because of technologies. But I really enjoy this conversation because it's less about technology, it's really more about defining that belonging, the sense of place within an organization or in the community. So my key question here is, how do we tie the information, because we definitely live in an overloaded information world. And whether it's an employee or an individual, I'm constantly dealing with sifting through tons of information. how can organizations help me perform my best? And to what degree, how we look at and assess technologies that can aid for them to perform, whether I'm a salesperson, whether I'm a HR person, whether I am doing whatever, but ultimately driving the corporate mission and the vision. How do you see content? What is the role of content? And how do you see that empowering each of this to perform in real time? And do you really see technology powering a lot of that?
I think that we're going to see, as we have employees who expect a very personalized, customized experience at work, that content will be pushed to you, knowing who you are, knowing what your interests are. That's how we're going to empower technology to our best advantage, because we are all overwhelmed with content, let's face it. But if I know kind of your preferences and I know what you need to know, then that content can be pushed. And that's already happening in learning, as you may be aware. That's certainly something that we're trying to embrace in our own platform, is to understand, use searchable information about skills people are aspiring to learn, so that we're now pushing learning content their direction. We're pushing people in the organization. Have you reached out to this person? You've said you want to mentor on these skills, and this person is really interested in learning. Because we also believe that learning has to be micro. It has to be on the job. And if you're going to read a white paper, that's great. But you're probably not going to have time to attend a class.
Right. We are in a transitional state right now as far as how we think about information, right? Where we're still at the point where we think we're being overwhelmed, but what it really means is that we have an overwhelming amount of choice, but just wait 5 years and people are going to say, oh, I can focus wherever I want to focus, because we're still under the illusion that we should process all the information. And that's actually not true. And there's going to be a cultural shift that's going to happen over the next, hopefully we'll be smart enough, but probably not. But our kids maybe will figure that out.
Right.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think it's all going to be about point in time, digestible information that happens at the point in which you need it, that's designed and personalized for you. That's going to be the role of content. And I think the organizations that have the ability to really mobilize content in that way are going to be the ones that individuals say, you know what, I understand this process. I get to learn. And it's not going to be about, do I have this course over here or this course over here? It has to happen in real time in the context of the work that you're doing.
Right.
And that's really the key. And in our world, in the world of human capital, frankly, I don't see a system out there that if a system is not focused on how to deploy content in that way, they're going to lose in this game, because it's really the content is going to be the differentiator.
Well, and really this plays to what I think we were talking about earlier, which is if we are all going to become lifelong learners, which is absolutely the requirement, we don't have a choice. If Ray is right, the pace of change is accelerating extremely rapidly. We can't envision what we're going to need to know in the next 5 years. Exactly. If the tools themselves don't embed themselves into the work processes, if you think of a woodworker, has to know exactly which chisel to go and pull off the shelf and use on that table. The tools themselves have to be smart, embedded into the work processes, because that's the only way we're going to be able to have people continually upskilled on an ongoing basis.
And you build that, Gary, I'll fund it.
Sorry. Great, you're on. You're on.
That's a better way to end.
So,
That's okay.
Yeah. Okay. So great. So I'm sorry. On that note, we're past our time. Please thank our guests here and.